What is God's relationship to time? Is God in time or is God timeless? We're going to discuss this question in detail with my guest tonight, Dr. Ryan Mullins. And Dr. Mullins has actually been interviewed by me previously. Hey there, Dr. Mullins.
Hey.
We've got really exciting news for you, the viewer. Dr. Mullins, go ahead and tell us what your surprise is.
Right. So I'm going to give away a free copy of my new book, God in Emotion, to whoever asked the best question tonight during the Q&A. So if you ask the best question, Jordan and I are like, yeah, that one's great. Then we'll ask for your contact information and then I'll mail you a copy of the book.
So you have to stick around until the end of the interview for the Q&A. And whoever Ryan picks, that person needs to contact me on my Facebook page, Crash Course Apologetics, and I'll get you in touch with Dr. Mullins so that he can send the book to you. Okay, so before we begin the interview, will you just say briefly what got you interested in the topic of God's relationship to time?
Oh, actually, this goes back to high school. So in high school, I was reading Mere Christianity for an English class. And there was a chapter that C.S. Lewis starts out with saying, this is a chapter you might want to skip. And my English teacher was like, you will not be skipping this. You guys have to read this. And so we're like, okay, whatever. And so we read it. I didn't really understand any of it. And then the next day in class, when we were supposed to be discussing it, she said something like, if this is not blowing your mind, like this idea that God's timeless, if this is not blowing your mind, then you're not really thinking about it. You don't really understand it. And I remember just going, oh, wow, like that is nuts. That is crazy. Like I need to know more about this. And then at some point later on, when I got into my master's program, into my PhD, I was like, I think I've got enough now. I can start to explore this issue. So that was really what started. It was high school.
Cool. I definitely wasn't thinking this kind of stuff in high school. I
Yeah.
bloomed late, I guess. Too late. I didn't get a philosophy degree. Oh, well. So let's jump in now. So this is a difficult question to begin with here. But what is time?
Right. So St. Augustine has a discussion on this in the Confessions. And so he's got this very famous moment where he asks the question, what is time? And he says, I know exactly what time is unless you ask me. And then as soon as you ask him, he's like, well, I really don't know anymore. He's at a loss for words. But this is like actually really common in most discussions in philosophy and science and theology. They just kind of start with this question from Augustine and they quote him saying he doesn't know, and then they move on. And there's a contemporary philosopher named Marcello Oreste Fiocco who gets really annoyed with this. And he says, like, all these conversations in contemporary philosophy of time, no one's answering this question, what is time? And so he thinks it's very unfortunate. And I do too, because I think a lot of confusion arises in theology and philosophy and in science over this dispute of time because nobody's wanting to address that question. And so I think what would really help a great deal is we had some kind of good answer to that question. So what I'll do is I'll introduce two very popular theories throughout history, which are called the absolute theory of time and the relational theory of time. And I'll start with the absolute theory. So Fiocco, who I mentioned a minute ago, so he says that time is this natured entity that plays several different roles. And he identifies three different roles that time plays. So he says time is a natured entity that makes change possible, is the source of moments, and is the thing that unifies a series of moments. And this is actually really similar to some different statements I found in some ancient Hindu and Jainist philosophical texts, and also some different Western thinkers like Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke. And so within Eastern philosophy, people who say that they affirm this absolute theory of time, what they do is they say time is this eternal, uncreated substance, and it's distinct from moments. And so this eternal, uncreated substance, it plays several roles. So they'll say it's responsible for making change possible. It's responsible for making things exist at the present. It explains the direction of causation. It explains why some events are earlier than others. And they'll say like this sort of stuff. And so time is this eternal substance that plays all these different roles on the absolute theory. But notice here on the absolute theory makes a distinction between time and moments of time. And so you have to ask, what is a moment of time? And so a moment of time, it's an abstract object that describes the way things are, but the way things could be subsequently otherwise. So a moment is like a when things happen. So things happen at a moment. And so when things happen, they can be subsequently otherwise at the next moment. And so some moments, you might say, are realized or actualized. So for example, like I'm at this moment, like I'm sitting, but I could be otherwise at the next moment. because I could stand up and just leave and just, leave Jordan here sitting with his live chat by himself. I'm not going to do that, but I could. These are options. So those are moments. But a timeline is an ordering of a particular set or series of moments. And so for people watching, some people might be familiar with kind of this talk about possible worlds. And so possible worlds, they often contain timelines. So someone like Arthur Pryor might say that possible worlds are built out of possible timelines. And so then if you're a theist, what you'd say is that God considers all the different possible timelines that he might providentially bring about. So that's all kind of like the absolute theory. If people who defend the relational theory of time, they don't like a lot of this stuff. So the relational theory of time says that time is merely a relationship between events. And so they'll say time is not a substance on this view. It's just a relationship. And so time is not fundamental on this view. So instead, time is just simply reduced away to merely the relationship between events. And so events are supposed to be more fundamental on this relational story. And so events explain the existence of time. And so the relational theory of time says that time exists if and only if change exists, because change creates a before and an after between events. And so those are the two views that you see throughout history. You've got this absolute theory and this relational theory. And the absolute theory, again, has a distinction between time and moments of time, whereas the relational theory is just the moments themselves or just events.
Very good. Okay. So what is an objection then to that relational theory of time?
Mm-hmm. So very early on in the East and in the West, people noticed that the relational theory of time suffers from a kind of circularity problem. And so, for example, Aristotle was aware of the circularity problem, but he still tried to defend the view and carry it on. A contemporary philosopher named Ulrich Mayer, he's developed a really powerful version of the circularity objection. And so it goes a little something like this. So again, on the relational theory of time, time is just reduced to events. So events are supposed to explain the existence of time. And so events are supposed to be the fundamental story. They're more fundamental than time itself. And that's the story. But Mayer says well, hang on a second here. So tell me what an event is. And so then what Mayer does is he surveys all the different leading definitions of events. And in every single definition of an event, time is already presupposed in the definition of an event. And so that's a problem. And here's kind of how it goes. So the relational theory, it's supposed to tell me that events explain the existence of time. And so the relational theory is supposed to tell me that events are more fundamental than time. But if time is already built into the nature of events, then time is more fundamental than the events themselves. And so that's a vicious circularity. So let me give you a couple examples of this so you can see it. So one definition of an event says that an event is a substance having a property at a time. And so notice that time is already built into the definition there. And you cannot have that if events are supposed to be more fundamental than time. So here's another example. So an event is the occurrence of something at a time. And again, time's already built there into the definition of an event. And so that's a problem for the relational theorist because she wants to say that events are more fundamental than time itself. So I think that this objection to the relational theory of time, I think it's very serious. So you've got this very serious circularity objection that renders the view just incoherent.
Okay, so we've got these two theories of time right now, the absolute theory and the relational theory. And it seems like the relational theory suffers from this circularity problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes you think, so then I'm left with the absolute theory of time.
Right.
But what problem would the theists have with the absolute theory of time? And then how do you think a theist can respond to that problem?
Right. So recall that the absolute theory, at least the versions that you see in Jainism and Hinduism, they say that time is this uncreated eternal substance. And so that gives you a potential problem. So as I understand it, the concept of God is that God is a single ultimate ground of reality. And so one way to kind of develop this concept is to say that God is the creator of everything other than himself. And so if you think that God is the creator of everything other than himself, then you're going to have a problem with the absolute theory of time. Because you can't have God creating an uncreated eternal substance, because that's impossible to create an uncreated thing. So it might seem like the absolute theory of time just goes against the very idea of God being the creator of all things. But you don't have to worry, though, because different thinkers in history, they've already kind of dealt with this objection. So within the Hindu tradition, there's this guy named Raghunatha Shiromani. And then Samuel Clarke and Isaac Newton in the Christian tradition, they developed a very similar kind of view. And so they say that what you do is you should have time identified with God. So time is not a substance that exists independently of God, because instead God is time, or time is like an attribute of God. And that sounds kind of weird, it's kind of shocking, but here's a way to kind of make sense of this. So God can fit the description of absolute time. So let me state the definition of time again, and then I can explain how God fits this description. So time is an uncreated eternal substance that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and it's the thing that unifies a series of moments. Well, God is an eternal, uncreated substance. God is a being with maximal power and freedom. And so God is this thing that can make change possible. And then God is the source of moments. So given the nature and existence of God, there's a way that things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So God exists and has free will. That's the way things are. And since God has free will, like things could be subsequently otherwise. Because by freely exercising his power, God is responsible for the existence of all subsequent moments. And then finally, God is the thing that unifies a series of moments, because God's responsible for why one timeline occurs instead of another through whichever providential actions he takes. So in this way, you can try to just say, is time the separate thing from God? No, time is identified with God in some sense. Time is either is God itself or just like an attribute of God.
That's really interesting. And before you had sent me those notes, I was unaware of that kind of move. So
Yeah, it's not been discussed a lot in contemporary literature, hardly at all. And so when I first started kind of going down this road like a couple of years ago of going, hey, maybe this works, I was like, oh, this is nuts. This is crazy. Who would want to affirm this? And I was like, well, Isaac Newton affirmed this, so that's okay. Oh, but he had a mental breakdown. So like maybe like I'll have a mental breakdown too. I don't know. Maybe this is nuts. We'll see. We'll see how this goes.
We'll see. Okay. So all of that was just to kind of prep the discussion here on what time is. It's going to depend on what kind of theory you take. We saw a reason to think the relational theory of time, that's got a problem. The absolute theory might at first glance present a problem to the theist, but you offered a kind of solution for that there. Okay, so now we want to ask, what are the most popular views in the debate over the ontology of time? And you may want to say what ontology means here as well.
Right. So ontology is like existence. And so when we're asking about the ontology of time, here's the big question. What moments of time exist? And so the two most popular answers to that are views called presentism and eternalism. I mean, there are some other views that have started to gain some attention again in philosophy of time. So there's this thing called like the growing block. There's another view called the moving spotlight. And then there's this other weird view called fragmentalism that has attracted like some people's attention. But presentism and eternalism, these are like the most popular views today. So I'll just unpack those a bit. So the presentist says only the present moment of time exists. Past moments no longer exist, and future moments do not yet exist. Here's another way you could state presentism. So earlier I had said that like a moment is an abstract object that describes the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. And then a timeline is like a particular like ordering or set of ordered moments. And so the presentist can say that all abstract times that exist on the timeline, but only one of them is concrete or actual. And so all of the stuff that happened in like the 1800s, like that's over and done with. Like those events, they just no longer exist. Like and because like only thing that's happening right now at the present, that's the only thing that's actual. That's the only thing that exists. Now the eternalist disagrees with all of that. So she says that all of the moments in the timeline are concrete or actual. So all of the moments are fully real. So like Jordan, like you and I like exist at this moment, but things that are going on in 1983 and also things that are happening in like the year 2525, all this stuff is actually happening. It's all real. It's all fully real, just as real as this moment is. And so the eternalist says, you know, that's how the story of the world is. But she'll also say like there's still real change and succession in the world. And she'll say there is a definite direction to time. Time only has like one direction. And all the moments are ordered successively in like earlier than and later than relations. But all of the moments in the timeline are actual. They're all real. And so that's like eternalism and presentism in a nutshell. And we'll see this again pop up like these like when we look at some of the different views on God and time. So just keep this kind of stuff, I guess, in the back of your mind.
Okay, perfect. So you laid out two very popular views there, presentism and eternalism, and explained what each was. Now, most Christians throughout history have affirmed that God is timeless. So I want to ask you, what is divine timelessness?
Right. So one thing to understand in these debates that we're looking at is everyone agrees that God is eternal. And so God is eternal in that God exists without beginning and without end. When you say that God is timeless, you have to make a further statement. So when you say that God is timeless, you say God exists without beginning, without end, because you're like, God's eternal. But then you go on to say God also exists without succession, without temporal location, and without temporal extension. And so if God undergoes succession, God is going to be doing one thing and then another. And so he's going to be changing from doing one thing to doing something else, or he'd change from being one way to being another way. And so if you want a timeless God, you have to deny all that. You can't say he changes in any way, and he does not undergo any kind of succession. And so here's how some different medieval philosophers would try to kind of like articulate this point. So people like Boethius or Thomas Aquinas, they would say that God exists in a timeless present that lacks a before and after. And so there's a way that God is, but then they'll say God cannot subsequently be otherwise, because there's just God in this like one timeless present moment doing whatever he is eternally doing, and that's it, without any change, without any succession. And then further, God cannot have any temporal location or extension. And so that means that God's not located like in a moment, or like a temporal moment of time. And so God does not persist over a series of temporal moments like you and I do. So like with objects like you and I, like we have temporal location because like here I am at this moment. Well, now I'm at the next moment. So I persist from moment to moment. But you can't say that about a timeless God. And so a contemporary philosopher named Paul Helm, he defends divine timelessness. And so he tries really hard to stress that a timeless God cannot stand in any temporal relations with the created universe. And so Helm says that God cannot stand in any temporal relation like being earlier than or later than or simultaneous with like anything in the created universe, because those are temporal relations, and a timeless God cannot stand in any temporal relations. So that's what a timeless God looks like.
Very good. Now, what is divine temporality?
Mm-hmm. So again, everyone in these debates, they want to say God is an eternal being. And so people who affirm that God is temporal, they're going to say God's an eternal being. So that means, again, that God exists without beginning and without end. If you want to say that God is temporal, much like with timelessness, you have to make a further claim above and beyond that God's merely eternal. And so if you say that God's temporal, you're going to say he exists without beginning and without end, but God can undergo succession, and he can have temporal location, and he can have temporal extension. So in divine temporality, God can undergo succession and change because he is free to exercise his essential power. So when God freely exercises his omnipotence, God changes from not doing anything to doing something. And so that's just part of what it means to perform an action. God does one thing and then another and so on. And depending on your ontology of time, like if you go with like the presentist or the eternalist story, you're going to unpack God's temporal location and extension differently. So if you're a presentist, then you're going to say that God is wholly located at the present moment of time. Whereas if you're an eternalist, then you're going to say, well, God's located at all moments of the timeline. But either way, you're going to be affirming that God is an eternal being who exists without beginning, without end. And you're going to say that God can undergo and does undergo change and succession.
Now, let's consider an argument for divine timelessness. So we just laid out these kind of two descriptions of what it would be for God to be timeless and what would it be for God to be temporal. But let's consider first an argument for divine timelessness. So you call this, or it's been called, the argument from perfection to changelessness. Okay, so go ahead and describe that argument. What is it? And then how might one respond to that argument?
Okay, so the argument runs in basically two steps. So the argument starts by saying, look, we all agree that God is perfect. Because, no one wants to deny that God's perfect. Everyone's like, yeah, of course, God's perfect. Well, since God's perfect, then you're like, well, God cannot get better and he cannot get worse. So if God could somehow get better, or then it doesn't seem like he was really that perfect to begin with. And if God could somehow get worse, then, well, it must not have been that great to start. So like, you might say, like, surely a perfect being just can't become less than perfect. So the first step in the argument is just to say, let's just assume that God is perfect. And then the second step in the argument is say, well, there's another assumption we need to make. And this is this: all change is for the better or worse. So if God changes, then God's going to become either better or worse. And so you've got these two assumptions. So God is perfect and all changes for the better or for the worse. And so from these two assumptions, then you can draw some kind of conclusion. You could say, well, since God is perfect, God cannot change for the better or worse. And since all changes for the better or worse, well, then God cannot change because God's perfect. And so God's perfection is going to entail that God is changeless or immutable. And if God's changeless, then God cannot undergo succession. And when that's exactly what divine timelessness wants to say. They're like, well, of course, a timeless God lacks change and succession. So it would seem like God's perfection just forces us to say that God is timeless and unchanging. And so that's the argument from perfection to changelessness. Now, the second part of the question, though, you asked was like, how would someone respond to the argument? So here's how someone might respond. They'll say, well, okay, again, there's these two assumptions in this argument, that God is perfect and that, all changes for the better or for the worse. And so someone might focus in on that second assumption and say that second assumption is really dubious. And they'll just say it's not obvious that all changes for the better or worse. You could also try to call into question like the first assumption and say like, of course, God's perfect, but you're offering a really like shallow analysis of divine perfection. But just for the sake of brevity, I'll just focus on the second assumption that like all changes for the better or worse. So consider a possible world in which there only exists like two atoms just like floating in the void. And so at one moment, like the two atoms are in one position relative to each other. And so say like the first atom is like just like to the left of the second atom. And then think about then things change. And so there's a new moment. And the atoms change their positions. And so now the first atom is like to the right of the second atom. And then someone could say, well, is that really like better? Have things gotten better or worse? I mean, things have certainly changed, but it doesn't seem obvious that things have gotten better or worse. You've just got atoms just changing their positions. That's not better or worse. So it just seems false that all change is for the better or worse. And if that's false, well, the argument from perfection, it's relying on a false assumption about change, and in which case the entire argument just falls apart. So that's one way you could respond to this argument.
All right. So just to bring anyone in, if you just joined, what's happening. So at this point in the discussion, we have laid out some definitions and theories of time. And then we are now discussing God's relationship to time. So we've got these two views on offer. We've got timelessness and temporality. And Ryan just summarized an argument for divine timelessness and then offered a response to that. What I want to ask now is about an argument against divine timelessness. So what is creation ex nihilo? I think I'm saying that right. I always read it and I never have to say it. Is it nihilo or nihilo?
Nihilo, I think, is the way to go.
Nihilo. Okay. Yeah. Creation ex nihilo. And how does that view cause problems for divine timelessness?
Right. So I'll start with just kind of explaining like creation ex nihilo, or just creation out of nothing. So the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, so this is where is like God is said to create the universe out of absolutely nothing. And so God does not rely on any pre-existing material. But the doctrine actually goes further in order to distinguish itself from something called like a doctrine of eternal creation, and then some other views called like emanation. So on a doctrine of eternal creation, the universe is said to be co-eternal with God. So God never exists without a created universe of some sort. And the doctrine of creation ex nihilo says, well, that's just false. Creation ex nihilo says that God created the universe at some point, and that the universe is not co-eternal with God. So there's this state of affairs where God exists without the created universe. And so you can call this God's like pre-creation existence, or this pre-creation moment. And so here's the idea. So God is eternal, which means, again, that God exists without beginning. Well, creation ex nihilo says the universe began to exist, so the universe cannot be co-eternal with God. So that's why it's not a doctrine of eternal creation. It's something else. But I want to kind of clarify this point here, because sometimes people accuse me of like just kind of making up this definition, because I think they're just basically just ignorant of basic church history. So, which is a hard thing to say. Well, it's not hard to say because I just said it with a smile on my face. So yeah, so let me demonstrate that I'm not making this up. Like this just really is the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So the contemporary Christian philosopher and a defender of divine timelessness named Brian Leftow, here's how he states the doctrine. So this is a quote from him. He says, "Before all else existed, God existed alone, or God and only God did not begin to exist." And then Sam Liebens has this brand new book out called The Principles of Judaism. And here's how he defines the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So he says, the universe was created by God at some point in time, perhaps the first moment in time, before which there was nothing except God. Now, let me give you two historians. So again, just to really demonstrate I'm not just making this up. So David Ferguson explains how Christians during the 2nd and the 4th century understood the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And so David Ferguson says, nor can the world be described as eternal. The life of God is prior to the life of the world. Even if this cannot be expressed as a temporal priority, we cannot set the world as co-eternal alongside the triune being. And then the final quote I'll give you is from Alexander Brodie. He's a medieval scholar. And so he says, here's how the late medieval understanding of creation ex nihilo goes. So this is a quote. He says, in the high Middle Ages, all the major theologians of the Christian West teach that God created our world ex nihilo. That is, that first there is God and no world, and then by an act of divine will, there is a world which is in some sense at a distance from and therefore other than God. So there you go. That's the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. How does this cause problems for divine timelessness? Well, hopefully it's going to be like really obvious to see at this point. So creation ex nihilo says first you've got God all by himself and completely alone, and then you've got God with the entire created universe. And so that looks like a change in the life of God. God's going to change in several different ways. First, God's going to go from existing alone to existing with a created universe. Second, God's going to change from not creating to creating. And then third, God's going to change from knowing that he exists all alone to knowing that he exists with a created universe. And that just scratches the surface of all the kind of changes that I could point out that are going on. But we've already got way too many changes for divine timelessness. So it seems like if God creates a universe ex nihilo, then God's going to be undergoing change in succession, and timelessness can't have that.
Now, how do proponents of divine timelessness respond to that kind of objection that you just raised?
Mm-hmm. So people have tried to avoid this in contemporary debates by adopting the eternalist ontology of time that we talked about earlier. But that's not the traditional move. So the traditional strategy is to deny that God is really related to the universe. But contemporary defenders of divine timelessness, like Catherine Rogers, they say that that's just implausible from a Christian perspective. If God's omnipresent, like he needs to be really related to the universe. Otherwise, omnipresence is just going to be meaningless. So what people like Catherine Rogers and Paul Helm do is they'll just say, not really related to the universe. That's weird. I don't know what that means. Get rid of it. Let's adopt an eternalist ontology of time in order to avoid some of these objections. And so what they say is that God and the entire timeline are co-eternal. And they'll say there is no state of affairs where God exists without the created universe and all of the moments on the timeline. And so let me say that move again in case anybody missed it. So the problem is that you have God existing without creation and then existing with creation. And so what Rogers and Helm do is they say God never existed without creation. So there's no change or succession in the life of God when it comes to creating the universe. That's the move that they make.
That to me just seems like a straight denial of creation ex nihilo, right?
I think so. They want to push back and say no. But yeah.
What did he create then?
Yeah. So he's created so they'll say he created ex nihilo because they'll say the universe had a beginning. But I'm like, well, okay, that doesn't look like creation ex nihilo anymore, because creation ex nihilo again says there's a state of affairs where God exists without the universe. What it looks like is you've got the doctrine of eternal creation that I mentioned earlier. So the doctrine of eternal creation said God always exists with a universe of some sort. There's no state of affairs where God ever exists without the created universe. And so that looks exactly like what Rogers and Helm have affirmed. But they're saying, no, I'm affirming creation ex nihilo. So I think what they've done is unintentionally, unwittingly ended up denying the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and replaced it with something else. If you are a panentheist, so a panentheist is someone who says creation ex nihilo, that's false. I don't like it. God's always existed with a universe of some sort. Like if you're a panentheist, you're going to be like, well, cool, that's fine. I want a doctrine of eternal creation. But if you're a classical theist, like Helm and Rogers, then you're going to be like, oof, no, I want my creation ex nihilo. So I think there's a conflict here. So if you're a panentheist, you can just kind of go, no big deal. Whereas if you're a classical theist and you have to be affirming creation ex nihilo, then you've got a problem because you ended up rejecting creation ex nihilo.
Okay, so we've got timelessness and temporality on offer. We gave an argument for divine timelessness, but then critiqued it. And then we just offered an argument against divine timelessness from creation ex nihilo. And now we want to consider another objection to divine timelessness. And you call this the "what time is it now" objection. So just summarize that for me.
Yeah, so this is an objection about the incompatibility of God's omniscience with something called tensed facts. So I need to distinguish what are called tensed and tenseless facts, and then you can understand the objection. So tensed facts are facts about the past, present, and future. So for example, if I say, like, I'm talking to Jordan now, like, that's a tense fact. Or I will be answering Jordan's questions. That's also a tense fact. Or I was drinking Red Bull to help me power through the midnight hour. Like, that's a tensed fact. So tensed facts, they make reference to what was the case in the past, like what is the case now at the present, and what will be the case in the future. But tenseless facts, they're different. So tenseless facts, they only make reference to earlier than, later than, or simultaneous with relations. So tenseless facts, they try to describe the world without any reference to the past, present, or future. So here's some examples here. So there's this, I'm in Edinburgh at the moment, and so there's a mountain here called Arthur's Seat. And so you could say Ryan sits on top of Arthur's Seat at 2 p.m., October 12th, 2019. And that's a tenseless fact because it makes no reference to the past, present, or future. Ryan sitting on top of Arthur's Seat is earlier than the event of Ryan talking to Jordan. It's also a tenseless fact because, again, it's not making any reference to the past, present, or future. So tensed and tenseless facts, they are different kinds of facts. They're not reducible to one another. And so they each try to capture different facts about the world. Now, if God is omniscient, then God will know all of the facts about the world. And so here's a really obvious tensed fact. There's a tensed fact about what time it is now or what is happening right now. And if God is omniscient, then God will need to know that tense fact about what is happening right now. But here's the problem for divine timelessness. The tensed fact about what is happening right now, well, it's always changing. It's constantly changing. So if God knows the tense fact about what is happening right now, then God will be constantly changing and thus undergoing succession. And so God's knowledge of what is happening right now is going to be constantly changing. And so God cannot be timeless. So that's the basic problem here of the "what time is it now" objection.
How do proponents of divine timelessness respond to this objection?
So there are philosophers who have tried to deny the existence of tensed facts. And you see this a lot in debates over God and time from like the 1970s to like the early 2000s. I'll just mention Paul Helm again. So Helm says that God is timeless, and he's like, I give you that eternalist ontology of time. He's like, that's true. And in different papers, what Helm does is he tries to argue that that all we need to describe the world are tenseless facts. And so the claim is that tensed facts do not exist. And since there are no tensed facts in existence, there are no tensed facts for God to know. And so if the problem is, well, what time is it now, or what's going on right now? Well, there is no fact of the matter about what's happening right now. And so does God know that? Well, of course not, because there's nothing there to know. And that's not a problem for the omniscience of a timeless God. So no problem here. Get rid of the tensed facts.
It's a similar kind of, I guess, objection to foreknowledge, or at least counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, something like that don't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
There's no ground there.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, they're just denying this kind of temporality, I guess. There's no
So you're thinking like the open theist. It's like when the open theist says the future doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there for God to know, so he knows all the things there are to know. Still omniscient, and then right. Paul Helm's going to be. Well, Paul Helm shouldn't complain too much, but he does, because the open theist could be like, "Well, you're just saying there's some other things that don't exist, so God doesn't know them." I'm doing the same game you are, Paul. But Paul doesn't like that. But yeah, but you're right. I think that is basically what's going on here.
So how do you respond to that kind of, how would you answer Helm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the underlying claim again is that like the big idea is that like the tenseless theory is the real story of the world. It's like the true scientific story of the world only includes these tenseless facts. And so like the true scientific story of the world is what I've often told, says no tense facts, none whatsoever. But more recently, philosophers like Ollie Pearson have argued that this just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And they'll just say that just can't possibly be true. The scientific story of the world just, it really does need tensed facts. And here's why. So when we reflect on the nature of like reason, emotion, and our free action, we cannot get rid of tensed facts. So when you're performing an action or if you're having an emotion, you're responding to reasons. And so there's a reason that you acted the way that you did, or there's a reason that you feel the way that you do. Um, and those reasons are usually like tensed facts. Now, of course, like you often act or feel certain ways on the basis of bad reasons, but sometimes you have like, they're on the basis of a good reasons, and good reasons that actually do track the way the world is. They track reality. And so what Pearson argues is that an overwhelming majority of your actions and emotions are responding to tensed facts. And so those tense facts, those are the reasons for your actions and your emotions. So let me give you some examples of this here. So say that I was like really anxious about this YouTube interview. And so as soon as the video is over, I just say, oh, thank goodness that is over. In that moment, I'm having the emotion of relief. And the reason for my relief is the tensed fact that the interview is over and done with. It's in the past. But if there are no tensed facts, then my emotion is not responding to any fact about reality. But that just sounds like crazy talk, because like surely my emotion, like it's obviously responding to something. And so what Pearson says is that if you deny tense facts, you need to find some kind of tenseless fact that my emotion is responding to. And he's like, there's no good candidates. So, for example, consider the tenseless fact: Ryan stops talking to Jordan at 2 a.m. December 17th, 2020. My emotion of relief, I don't think is responding to that fact at all. Because imagine like yesterday, like say like yesterday, I was like really anxious about this. And then my wife comes to me and she's like, Amore, don't worry about this. It's fine. Consider the fact that Ryan stops talking to Jordan at 2 a.m. on December 17th, 2020. Surely that's going to give you some kind of relief. And I would just look at her and be like, no, it doesn't give me any relief. Why? Well, because I know that the interview is going to happen tomorrow. And so my emotions, like they're about these tense facts. They're not about tenseless facts. So in order for me to feel relief, I need to know that the interview is now over and done with. And if I don't know that it's now over and done with, then I'm not going to be feeling any relief. And so here's the main point here. So the tenseless theory says you only need these tense facts in order to describe the world, but that just seems false, because you need the tensed facts in order to describe the world. You cannot give a full description of my emotions unless you also appeal to tense facts. But Ollie Pearson goes further with this too. So he says there's a related problem. So again, the claim was supposed to be, well, the true scientific story of the world is only with tenseless facts, no tense facts. And Pearson's like, well, science relies on observations or perceptions. And your observations or your perceptions, they're always about the present moment. They're always about what's happening right now. And so your observations are of tensed facts. And so science relies on observation. And so that means science relies on tense facts. So we need access to tensed facts in order to even do science. So according to Pearson, the tenseless theory, which says that there are no tense facts, he's like, that's just antithetical to science whatsoever. And so coming back to God and time, here's the takeaway from all of this. I do not think you can coherently say that there are no tensed facts, because it seems to me that we need tense facts in order to give a full description of the world. So if God's going to be omniscient, God's going to need to be aware of those tense facts. And a timeless being cannot be aware of those tense facts. So a timeless being cannot be the omniscient God. That seems like a very serious problem.
Very good. And you offered a good summary there. So we gave the what time is it now objection, and a response to that was there are no tensed facts. But then you gave two considerations for why we should think there are tensed facts. One was kind of this experience, and then the second was an argument that science depends on tensed facts. And you didn't include this, but I thought it was a good illustration. If you actually try to design an experiment, it's really hard to design that experiment without tensed facts referenced in like the procedures that you're going to follow. As you described it in the notes, I worked in a lab for 2 years and I could very much relate. And I was like, yeah, that would be challenging. So
yeah,
okay. we want to come back to an argument, or at least a point that might count in favor, at least at first glance, of a divine timelessness view. And I'll just ask you, does divine timelessness make better sense of God's providence and foreknowledge than divine temporality does?
So I hear this a lot in debates over God and time. And so the claim is supposed to be that if God is timeless, then God can foreknow the future. And then people often follow up with, and God needs to know the future in order to have providential control over history. The problem with this assertion, though, is that timelessness, as far as I can tell, is literally doing nothing in order to secure God's knowledge of the future. And so I've got a new paper out called Divine Temporality and Providential Boggery. And so I look at this argument in a lot of detail. So if people want to see that in detail, they can find that linked to at my webpage, rtmullins.com. But here's kind of the big idea. So what I do is I look at different views about like divine foreknowledge and providence, and just keep pointing out timelessness is not adding any advantage. And if anything, it seems to me that timelessness is actually preventing people from coherently telling the story of foreknowledge and providence. So all the positive work is typically being done by either the ontology of time or by propositions about the future. But let me give you like a quick concrete example of this, and then we can maybe like dig into some more details about some other views. So one claim is that God, like timelessly, like a timeless God can like literally see all moments of time at once in his timeless present. And then you ask, well, how do you make sense of that claim? And the way people try to make sense of it today is they'll say you need an eternalist ontology of time. And so again, on the eternalist ontology of time, all moments of the timeline exist and are thus there for God to observe. Well, here's the thing, though. You don't need timelessness to have any of that. Like you could affirm divine temporality and an eternalist ontology of time, because all of the work to give God an advantage here is being done by the temporal ontology. Timelessness is not adding anything to the story here. And so that's what I do is I just give an analysis of all of these for all these different theories of providence and say in each case, something else is doing the work, and the temporalist, they can just say the same thing.
Okay. So let's go ahead. We're actually going to be wrapping up the discussion soon. We're getting close to the end here, and that means you need to go ahead and be thinking of the question that you want to ask. And remember, we're giving away, Ryan is giving away a free paperback book. You can hold it up there.
There we go. There we go.
The person that asked the best question. So this is his book, God in Emotion, published by Cambridge, and it's a little book. I think you'll enjoy it, and you want to be thinking right now about that question. I will ask in probably 5 to 10 minutes for you to type that question in the chat. So don't type it yet. Just be thinking about it, and I'll come back to you in about 5 to 10 minutes as we wrap up. Okay. Let's as we wrap up here, let's ask this. Does eternalism, so we had these two views, presentism and eternalism. Does eternalism come with a weird view of persons?
I think it does. I really do. I think eternalism gives you like this really super weird view of persons. So on presentism, you get this view of persistence over time called endurantism. And so endurantism says that objects exist as a whole or all at once at whatever moments of time they exist. And so basically objects exist with something called numerical identity. So you could ask yourself this kind of question, like how many Ryans are there in this video talking to Jordan? And the endurantist is going to say there's just one Ryan talking to Jordan. And that one Ryan is the numerically same Ryan. He persists from moment to moment throughout the duration of the video. But things get really weird if you're an eternalist, because on eternalism, you have to affirm this view of persistence called four-dimensionalism. And so four-dimensionalism is a doctrine of temporal parts. And so temporal parts are these objects that exist for only a single moment. And so on eternalism, all moments of the timeline exist, and all the temporal parts exist at their respective temporal locations on the timeline. So from 1983 all the way up to this video, there are numerically distinct temporal parts of me that exist at each moment. And each temporal part is a numerically distinct Ryan, which is with its own thoughts, its own feelings, its own actions. So again, ask yourself now, how many Ryans are there throughout this video? Well, if you're a four-dimensionalist, then you're going to say there's a numerically distinct Ryan at each moment of the video. And you'll say, well, they have some kind of interesting relation to one another, such that you can talk about, there's a sense in which I can say I persist. And I persist over time by having later temporal counterparts at later moments of time. Like I'm stuck at this moment, but my counterparts, they exist at later moments. I think that's super weird, but there are a lot of philosophers today who just think it's great. They just think this is an amazing view.
Okay. And Justin Mooney, I was looking at his comment in the chat, and he anticipated this kind of four-dimensional consideration. So our eternalism and four-dimensionalism, you probably want to describe what that is, compatible with Christianity?
Right. So again, four-dimensionalism is this view of temporal parts. And I want to say they are not compatible. And so here's why I'd want to say this. So Jordan, say like I walked up to you and I'm like, Jordan, like things really suck right now. You know, there's a whole pandemic and everything happening. But if you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, God's going to give you this glorious afterlife. It's going to make up for everything. And because Jesus tells us, blessed are those who suffer, for they will be comforted in heaven. And so, Jordan, will you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior right now? Will you accept him into your heart? But before we answer that question, though, imagine that I say, oh, wait, Jordan, by the way, you're stuck at this moment of time. But if you accept Jesus, your numerically distinct temporal counterparts, they'll get to enjoy heaven. I mean, you won't enjoy heaven, that's for sure. But all these other Jordans, like that exist later, like they're going to get to enjoy heaven and new creation. So, Jordan, will you now say the sinner's prayer with me? Will you accept Jesus into your heart? I just want to say that's crazy. Like, that's nuts. Like, I would not want to say the sinner's prayer. I'd say something else that's that I won't say on air. Yeah.
My response when you put that in the notes, I did think about it. I was like, how would I respond to that? And I guess the question would sound to me the same as if you'd said, hey, if you pray this prayer and accept this, then some other person you don't know, you haven't met, they're going to enjoy a better state. And in that sense, I would probably be like, yeah, I guess I'll pray it, but man, it's too bad it's not going to help me either. Like, I'm glad it's helping somebody else, but that'd be great if it could help me too. But I guess I'm stuck.
You're a better person than I am, because I would not want to pray that prayer. I'd be like, well, great for that person, but what about me? Yeah.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to ask you, how would you sum up this whole discussion, trying to get at the question of what God's relationship is to time?
The biggest thing I guess I would say is philosophy of time is really hard. And I've been studying this for, I guess, about 10 years or so now. And it's a very difficult topic. I've done my best here to try to give an introduction to some of these views and to try to give people a lay of the land of like what the different views are and arguments for and against each one. But really, I'm just trying to introduce it as best as I can. So we've barely scratched the surface of this topic. It's a very complicated, it's a very difficult topic. I think it's very fascinating. But again, yeah, just try to introduce the view as best as I can.
Okay. I'm going to ask some questions now. So you go ahead, those watching, and I want you to, as you type in the live chat, begin with the word question. Okay. You can put it in all caps if you want. That may even be even easier. But begin with the word question so that it's very easy to find. If it doesn't have question at the beginning, I'm probably going to miss it. So go ahead and type that in right now, and we will begin. While you're doing that, while you're typing it in, I want to mention that I would love to have your support. So if you've liked this video, give me a thumbs up. If you have watched several of my videos, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And then if you want to contribute financially and help feed my family, then go to www.patreon.com/ccapologetics. So looks like some questions are coming in. I want to begin, though, with my super generous, so far the only one, and I greatly appreciate it, Fred Heiberg. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Fred gave a super chat of $5, so I really appreciate that, Fred. Fred said, on presentism, how long is the present moment? It seems that one can divide moments of time into infinitely small measurements.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a debate to be had here. I'll mention the two main views. So one view says the present is just an instant of zero duration. So it doesn't actually, how long does it last? That's just the wrong question. That doesn't make any sense. There's how long does something last is a question about a series of moments, not a single moment, because a single moment has zero duration. Another view, though, is where you've got these things called temporal atoms or chronons, and you see this in some different thinkers throughout the scientific revolution and some different thinkers in ancient Hinduism. And so this view says that there is a smallest unit that is a moment that you cannot divide any further. So it's supposed to be like a spatial atom, like a physical atom, but it's a temporal atom. Today, what people will say is what is it? I think it's like negative 10 to the 24ths of a second, I think is how long a chronon is supposed to be. How did they come up with that number? I don't know.
That's
I don't
your
know.
pay grade.
Yeah, it's above my pay grade, or they're doing something else, or they're doing math, and I'm like, I don't want to do the math. You figure it out. I'll just copy your homework. But yeah, those are the two main views: is either zero duration or the smallest possible unit of duration, where you cannot divide it any further, because otherwise you're going to get this infinitely divisible thing, and then you get these weird paradoxes like I can't walk across a room, or I can't walk for an hour because I'll never reach the end of the hour or something. So this is what people usually do: chronons or zero duration.
Okay. By the way, Fred also said he loves all the interviews on the channel and keep it up. So thank you very much, Fred. And that's a good reminder. Go check out Ryan's other interview that he did with me, where he talks about the attributes of God. It was a short video, about 17 minutes, and it's gotten a lot of views. So. Okay, let's get to some other questions here. I want to start at the top where they first come in. Okay. Brannon116 asked the following question: could a classical theist object to the ex nihilo argument by saying that the change that takes place is a Cambridge change? You probably want to explain what a Cambridge change is. Therefore, God doesn't begin to be related to creation.
Right. So a Cambridge change, this is a phrase that was first coined by the philosopher Peter Geach, who was a philosopher at Cambridge. And so a Cambridge change is a relational change. So I'll explain that in a second, but to just kind of flag where this is going, the claim, therefore, God doesn't begin to be related to creation, that wouldn't help, because a Cambridge change is by definition a relational change. So let me give you the more of the story on the Cambridge change. So right now I am in Edinburgh, Scotland, and so I am north of the Cambridge Divinity Building. Say I get on the train tomorrow and I go down to Cambridge, then I stand to the south of the Cambridge Divinity Building. The building itself does not undergo any intrinsic change, because it hasn't I didn't paint the building some new color. I didn't try to take a brick out of it or something, or destroy the glass of my old office or anything like that. So it's not undergone any intrinsic change, but it's gone in a change in relationship to me. And so this is what we call a mere extrinsic, a mere relational change, or a mere Cambridge change. Now, according to Paul Helm, who I mentioned earlier, Paul Helm says the kind of immutability you need in order to get timelessness is one on which God does not even undergo mere Cambridge change. Because if God can undergo these relational changes, that already presupposes he's in some kind of real relation to temporal objects, a relation of earlier than, later than, simultaneous with. And so Paul Helm's like, you can't have that, because timelessness means timelessness. Now, ancient and medieval Christians, they understood this too. So Augustine first kind of sees this problem. And so what Augustine says is, oh gosh, if God even changed in this kind of way, he'd change in his relationship. There'd be a new relationship he'd acquire. So what we have to say is God's not even really related to the universe in order to avoid even these kind of changes. So you could call them say the Cambridge change all you want, but I don't think it's going to help, because even someone like Augustine and Paul Helm is going to be like, yeah, you can't have those kind of changes, because those presuppose God's in some kind of temporal relationship already in which he would undergo succession. So yeah, I don't think it's going to help.
All right. The next question comes from A. McMahon. If God is timeless and changeless, could the members of the Trinity commune with each other before creation?
Okay. I'll do my best to argue yes. So people who affirm divine timelessness, they'll say there's just this one eternal moment, this one timeless present that lacks a before and after. And so whatever God's doing, just timelessly doing. And so they'll say God the Father is timelessly causing the Son to exist, and timelessly causing the Holy Spirit to exist. And they're just timelessly loving each other. And so they're just, whatever love they have, you could say it's like present love. It just never changes. So they wouldn't be able to have any kind of dynamic relationship in the sense of the Father going, hey, son, isn't the Holy Spirit pretty cool? And then the son going, yeah, that's great. And then the Holy Spirit going, thanks, guys. You couldn't have anything like that. Instead, you'd have to have them turn like timelessly going, we are great. Some people want to go, that's just not really communion in any meaningful sense. Whereas a lot of people in the classical tradition want to go, it's communion enough. It's even better kind of communion than what you and I have, where we have to like wait for responses and stuff. So I guess it kind of depends if you really do think that's communion enough.
Okay. The next question from Justin Mooney. He says the creation objection. Okay, I guess he's referring to that creatio ex nihilo objection. Okay, so what about the view that there is a state in God's life that is causally but not temporally prior to the first state of creation?
Yeah. So let's see here. This was something that I originally thought we should talk about, but we cut it because it was just too long. There's these crazy little things called logical moments in the life of God. And so this was something developed by John Duns Scotus. So John Duns Scotus noticed that there's these really serious problem if God can actually have free will, because whatever God's doing, he just is timelessly doing. And it seems like he never actually had a moment where he could make a decision or where he could have done otherwise. And it's related to this thing called the necessity of the present. And so Scotus is like, we got to do something better here. What if we create these things called logical moments? They're not temporal moments, I swear. They are not temporal moments. Don't you dare think they are temporal moments. There's all these logical moments. They function just like temporal moments, but they all exist somehow embedded in God's single timeless moment. And so what Scotus says is at the first logical moment, there's God, and he hasn't done anything. And so his future is completely open, completely undetermined. And so God could do whatever he wants at the next logical moment. And so the next logical moment, maybe God decides to create a universe. And so this is supposed to get you out of some of these kinds of problems about like God's freedom. And so what you see with Calvinists and Mullinists, they'll use this to try to articulate their theories of providence. They'll say at the first moment, God has a perfect knowledge of himself, his own nature, and he's able to know like all possibilities. But God can't know what will happen because it's completely open, it's completely undetermined. At the next moment, though, at the next logical moment, maybe he has like middle knowledge. If you're a Mollinist, if you're a Calvinist, you're like, no, he doesn't need that. What he gets to is just he has his free action. And on the basis of his free action, he thus foreknows what's going to happen. Now, does this help get out of the creation ex nihilo sort of thing? Not as far as I can tell, because all of this is embedded in the single timeless moment in which there's supposed to be God without the universe. So that's a different claim than these logical moments. If you want to try to like maybe use something in the neighborhood of that to say, well, what if like God's just like causally or logically prior to the universe, but there's never actually a state of affairs where God exists without the universe? Then I want to say that looks just like creation, like the eternal creation view. It doesn't look like the eternal. It doesn't look like creation ex nihilo. It looks like the eternal creation view. And to kind of like further draw this point home, there are people in the Islamic tradition who actually do in fact say just that. They're like, creation ex nihilo, that's crazy, that's false, because even if God's like logically prior or causally prior, he's still co-eternal with the thing, because whatever God eternally causes is going to be co-eternal. So you have eternal cause with an eternal effect. And then other people in the Islamic tradition go, well, that's just heresy, because creation ex nihilo is the real view. So we're going to condemn you and say there's a law out against you. We don't have that same kind of thing in the Christian tradition. But yeah, I think, I don't think it's going to help much, because I think you're still going to have something that looks like eternal creation instead of creation ex nihilo.
Graham Wall said, Swinburne argues in a paper that future free actions cannot be a part of God's foreknowledge if he is temporal. Do you think this necessarily follows from accepting that God is temporal?
No, I don't. I think it's a difficult question, but I don't think it necessarily follows. And Swinburne, I think if Swinburne's argument works, I don't think it matters if God's temporal or timeless, because the claim is, can you know what creatures with freedom, libertarian freedom, are going to do in the future? And you could still give that same kind of story if you just do with all the logical moments in God's timeless existence. So I don't think it necessarily follows, but yeah, I think it's a very complicated kind of question, though. So I would ask people to refer back to like the video with Taylor that you did earlier, because he goes through all the details of the freedom foreknowledge problem more quickly and better than I could with the time left that we got.
Yeah. Okay. The next one from Kyle Barrington. Phaser says, if time equals divine attribute, we must be pantheist / panentheist. Why think this? What is he missing? Also, what is the best metal band, and why is it Black Dahlia Murder? I'm not familiar with metal bands at all.
Right. Yeah. No. So I was gonna wear a metal shirt tonight, and then my wife was like, "You cannot wear another metal shirt," because I did a video where I was wearing a Slayer shirt, and it turns out like just this pentagram was showing. I didn't realize it in the live chat. Got lost on that, so that was a disaster. So I decided not to wear like a Black Dahlia Murder shirt tonight either, in case it just said like murder, and that was the only thing you could see on my shirt. So yeah. So the first part of the question. So would this entail pantheism or panentheism? I think the answer is no. Like what is Phaser missing? Well, lots of things. So a panentheist says that creation ex nihilo is false. God's always existed with a universe of some sort. And then they'll say the universe is in God in some interesting kind of way. But then what is that interesting kind of way? They just give me a million metaphors and like nothing concrete. So I've actually got 2 different papers where I argue this, that panentheism, it's not clear what the view actually is. But then some different people who are panentheists told me that I had solved the problem in my paper by making space-time God. And so in that sense, you could say objects actually have a literal location in God, in space-time itself. So if panentheists want to go that way, sure, cool. But how do you avoid being a panentheist and say that like God is time? Here's how you do it. You just affirm creation ex nihilo. And so then you're not a panentheist. You're not a pantheist. So a pantheist says the universe and God are identical. Well, if I say that like time is an attribute of God, that doesn't commit me to saying that like the universe is identical to God, because I'm not identical to time. You're not identical to time. Phaser's not identical to time. He's a being that exists in time, but he's not identical to time. So I don't see how it gets us to pantheism. So I'm not certain what's going on there. Now the best metal band. Oh man, I don't know. I'm strongly tempted to say Black Dahlia Murder, but I don't know if I could say they're the best. I've seen them a fair number of times at this point, but I don't know if I could say what the best is though. Yeah, I'm not. Oh, I don't know.
Bobby Nemeth asked, if the incarnation is when God becomes flesh and enters into our story, then would that be considered a change in God?
Mm-hmm. I want to say yes. And in my first book, The End of the Timeless God, I've got a whole chapter arguing for that. I didn't bring it up in this discussion before because a lot of people ask me, why didn't you start with the incarnation? Here's why I don't start with the incarnation in most of these debates. People like my friend Tim Paul, or they've got all sorts of fancy footwork they can do where they can try to explain away God, being timeless and still being incarnate. And so what I try to do is I go, well, let's just like soften up the claim. I can argue without the incarnation that God can't be timeless. And then when it comes to the incarnation, I can be like, do I really need all that fancy footwork in order to say God became incarnate? Like, yeah, of course it's a change. You've got God not being incarnate and then being incarnate. Seems like a change. Timelessness says God has no temporal parts. Well, if God's timeless and he's got this human part, it's temporal. Well, I don't know how to say the sun is really timeless if the sun literally has temporal parts. That seems kind of weird. So it seems also that the sun goes from not being in this unique hypostatic relation to the human nature, and then he comes to have this unique hypostatic relation to the human nature, and that thing's changing all the time. And it's changing its knowledge, it's changing its emotional states, it's changing its physical states, and those are things that are supposed to all be predicated of the sun. I don't see how you can get out of the change. I really don't. And I know, again, there's a lot of fancy footwork you can do, but I just don't find it plausible. I don't think it really works.
I've done 2 interviews with Tim Paul on the incarnation, and people can check that out for more of that fancy footwork he does.
Yeah.
So
he's a good dancer. He can do that.
In honor of Christmas, why the incarnation requires divine temporality. These are similar to what you
Mhm.
just said. So unless you want to add something, I'm going to move to the next one.
I guess I could add this. So the incarnation on the Christian story is supposed to be something that God did not have to do. It is a gracious act. And I think divine temporality really helps emphasize that, or at least you can see it and understand it a lot better, because you really do have God saying, do I want to create a universe and all the stuff that comes with it? I do. And if things go wrong, do I want to actually enter into like a strong union with them? I'm prepared to do that when the time comes. And then in the fullness of time, according to the New Testament, in the fullness of time, that is in fact what God the Son did. He came in flesh. So I think temporality just makes much better sense of the literal descriptions that we find in the Bible, which is all temporal descriptions.
Okay, I'm going to pause. We're at an hour and 5 minutes. And everyone, where Ryan is at right now, it's past 1 a.m. There's a bunch more questions. There's probably 15 more questions.
Okay.
Realistically, how much more time do you have, Ryan?
I can keep going. I'm fine. I'm a night owl, so it's all right.
Okay, just tell me. We'll try to go through them, but just tell me if you're like, hey, I need to cut it off.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so Darwin's Greatest Hits asked, what books or papers would you recommend on God and time?
So Natalia Deng, Deng, she has a book that came out in the same series as my God and Emotions book, in the same series that Tim Paul's book, the Incarnation, came out in, just called God and Time. And it's a really short, sweet introduction to the topic. It's only, I think, 60 pages long, and it gives you an overview of all the major thinkers. So I would start there and then just follow all the footnotes and all the people she mentions in the book. So that's where I would start.
That's a great recommendation. I'll probably do that. Okay. Brian Holland asked, what question can I ask that will result in me having the best question? You know what? That's the best question so far. Okay. The nerdy theist said, if the universe is co-eternal with God, does this make the universe necessary? And does this mean the, quote, timeline of the universe could not have been any other way?
Yeah, that's something I'm still trying to figure out. So if you have, it depends on a couple other things in your philosophy. So in the Middle Ages, they would have said yes. Here's why. So on Aristotle's understanding of modality, on Aristotle's understanding of what's necessary and what's contingent, Aristotle would say anything that is eternal is necessary, and anything that's necessary is eternal. Anything that is temporal or mutable or changes, Aristotle's going to say that's contingent. And so this is why it's such a huge deal in the Islamic and Jewish and Christian traditions, where they don't want the universe to be co-eternal with God, because they're going to say it's necessary, in which case God's not free to create. He's not sovereign over creation. And you're going to have this sort of necessity that maybe it would be the case that even we don't have freedom. So there's a lot of these kind of worries here that are at play. But today, a lot of people don't think that just because something is eternal, that it is necessary. So I think it depends on your modality. So for instance, someone like my friend Tom Ord, he's a panentheist. And so he's going to say God's always existed with a universe of some sort. And so what you could call just the cosmos, which is all the created stuff, that is co-eternal with God. God's never existed without it. But Ord's going to say God has some discretion, some freedom about which universe he brings about at which time. So maybe this universe didn't always exist. Maybe there's one before it, and then one before that, on into the infinite past. And so on that view, it seems like just because the whole created order of some sort exists, you could say that creation exists is necessary, but what stuff exists, that's all contingent. Which particular universe exists, that's contingent. So you'd have some necessity there that like it's necessary that God create, but it's not necessary what God creates or what stuff exists. So I guess there's some different moves you can make here to try to avoid like a full-blown necessity.
Okay, Ted Schaefer asked about the incarnation again. We've already hit on it a couple times, so I'm going to move to the next one.
Sure.
Taylor Sear, who I've done 2 interviews with on topics related to this, so you should check out that video with both videos with Taylor Sear. Do you think space is or is a part of God? I think he maybe is or is not a part of God. I don't know if he meant that. If not, why should we think time and space are different in this respect?
Right. Okay. So when I mentioned Raghunath Shiramani in the Hindu tradition earlier, and then Isaac Newton in the Christian tradition, they both say space is also an attribute of God, or that space just is God. So they want to say time, space, God can fill both of those roles. I don't know what to say about space. I find space very, very mysterious. So you can do the absolute theory of space, where space is just sort of like this container that can hold physical stuff. Or you could do this relational theory of space, where space is just a relationship between physical objects. I don't know. I don't know what to say about space. I don't have the same intuitions here, and I've not done enough work on it. So I don't feel strongly moved to say that space is an attribute of God or identify it in the same way that time is. Here's a couple ways you can try to make them kind of apart, though, other than me just saying, I don't know, I got nothing. There's something that Ulrich Mayer refers to as the time predicate link. When we predicate something of an object, we just intuitively predicated it of an object having it at a time. And so when we do the same thing when we're talking about God being timeless, we'll say that from God's timeless present, God is timelessly, or God is eternally, omnipotent, or God eternally, from all eternity, God predestined such and such. So even people who affirm divine timelessness, they treat God's timeless present as a date at which they predicate things. So there's this very strong intuition in all these different languages, in our natural languages, of how we do this. We don't do the same thing with space. So it might be the case that time is just fundamental to reality and space is not. I don't know. I'm not certain. I just don't have enough knowledge on space to give you good arguments for or against.
SlamRN asked, do people talk about whether time is continuous or discrete anymore? Or is that already covered in presentism versus externalism discussion?
They don't talk about it enough, in my opinion, because this is something I really want to know. So here's the debate here. It's not really covered with presentism or eternalism. It's orthogonal, I guess, to it. So time is discrete if you've just got an instant and then another instant and then another instant and so on and so on and so on. It's continuous if in between any instant or any two moments, there's another moment in between it. And in between those two moments, there's another one in between it, and then so on and so on, in which case you can infinitely divide it. And then you get into some of those paradoxes that I talked about earlier. Like, can I go walk for an hour? Will I reach the end of the hour? Well, can I go for an infinite amount of moments? Well, I can't walk for an infinite number of moments. That sounds exhausting. And also I just can't do that. I can't traverse an infinite. And so that's why I want to go with the discrete view instead of the continuous view. Now, when I've asked some different people about this who do philosophy of physics and some different physicists and mathematicians, a lot of people said, well, I thought we already proved that time has to be continuous. And then some others, they're like, well, no, we didn't prove it. It was easier because adding infinity into our equations makes things easier. So continuous time, you've got infinite. Well, infinites those are just simpler equations. If discrete time is true, I remember asking a physicist, I was like, well, can we just do this? And he's like, well, yeah, you could, but then you have to go find all the individual moments, and that makes the equations really ugly. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I have to make your job harder, but like at least it avoids all these ridiculous paradoxes. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stick with these really simple equations. So it seems to me that there is a debate to be had here, but people, I think I don't know, they're just not doing it. They just kind of assume it just must be continuous. There's these weird paradoxes, but I don't care. I'm going to do something else. That seems to be the attitude as far as I can tell.
Okay. W. Scott Taylor said, with zero duration by definition in timelessness, is consciousness possible for God?
Oh, yeah. That is, yeah. So this used to be a real big sticking point in kind of like the 80s and 90s over some of these debates. So if you've got this timeless moment that God exists in, some people would say, well, then God can't be a person because you need a series of moments in order to think and in order to act and in order to feel. And that's what a person is. Can't have that if he's timeless. William Lane Craig, even though Craig wants to reject divine timelessness, he says, like God just thinks whatever he's thinking at that one moment. and he's just thinking and he's feeling whatever he's feeling at that one moment, and he's acting whatever he's acting at that one moment, and that's enough. That's enough to be conscious and to be, a person. I'm happy to grant people that when I argue against timelessness, but ultimately at the end of the day, I do want to say that doesn't look right to me. That doesn't look like it's enough really to have any consciousness in any meaningful sense, and it's certainly not enough to act in any meaningful sense. I think it undermines God's freedom. So that's my intuitions on it, but I don't have time to unpack all those arguments.
Esoptron asks, does timelessness reduce God to a mere omnipotent force?
Possibly. So I guess I'm trying to think how you could articulate that argument. So you might think, I guess, kind of going back to the previous question, you might think, well, maybe if you're a timeless being, that's really it's not enough time to be conscious or act in any meaningful way. So the idea of God being a free agent, maybe you can't make sense of that. But God still has power. So it's just kind of this blind force. It's not really a person. So I guess if you do have the worry that a timeless being can't be a personal being in any meaningful sense and can't have freedom in any meaningful sense, then I guess you could say a timeless God is just a mere omnipotent force. So I think it kind of comes down to the previous question, how you want to answer that. And
this one's related. You can, because it has to do with consciousness. Random Theology says or asks, can a timeless God know experiential or non-propositional knowledge?
Mm-hmm. So let me explain what that is, and then I'll say that the classical tradition says yes, and I'm happy to grant that to them. So propositional knowledge is just knowledge that something is the case. So I know that Jordan exists. Now, someone might say, but there's this other kind of knowledge, though. There's this experiential knowledge. There's something that it's like to encounter Jordan. There's something that's like to talk to Jordan.
It's to experience greatness.
Exactly. So the sort of greatness that I'd only heard about, like in fairy tales, but then first time I met Jordan, I was like, there we go. This is, something to behold. Exactly. Yeah. So can God have experiential knowledge if he's timeless? Well, the answer is yeah, actually, yeah. And so when you look at the doctrine of impassibility, which is something that I talk about a lot in God and Emotion, I talk about God's perfect happiness in the classical tradition. And so the classical tradition says that God is perfectly acquainted with the greatest possible good. And if you are acquainted with the greatest possible good, you are happy. You experience bliss, or you experience like felicity, or all these other like really big superlative words. Well, God is identical to the greatest good on the classical understanding. And so a timeless God, he's identical to the greatest good. And so he's just experiencing this pure bliss. So he's experiential knowledge of himself. And then what it's like to have that experiential knowledge of himself is overwhelming happiness or joy.
William Keller asks, does an absolute theory of time, with time as an attribute of God, imply time is continuous? Would this be in conflict with causal finitism, which I think Alexander Proust says implies time is discrete?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a good question, because people like Isaac Newton, who I mentioned before, they think that time is infinite in the past, like that time necessarily has a tick to it. So it's always going next moment, next moment, next moment, next moment, next moment. In which case you would be running into Proust's arguments that you cannot have an infinite causal chain, that the causal chain has to be finite. It has to have a beginning. What I have this brand new paper that's going to be coming out any day now in Philosophia Christi called The Divine Time Maker. And so what I do in that paper is I argue that you can have this absolute theory of time and say that time is an attribute of God. And what you have is in the very first moment, a moment that never began to exist, is this first moment where God just completely alone, not doing anything, but it's a single moment, because a moment is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So there's no causal, like infinite causal chain here. It's just a single moment. And at the next moment, God creates a universe and you kick off this finite causal chain. So I think there is a way. You have to make the modifications that I do in my paper to the absolute theory in order to be consistent with Proust's view, which I do want to be consistent with it. But it's not something that historically other people who have affirmed this view have done. So I think that it's a good question to bring up.
This is related, and that paper sounds really interesting. I want to read it. Andrew Loke argued, I guess with Graham Oppie, the other, I don't know if you caught that debate or not, but Andrew Loke argued that divine timelessness is crucial to the Kalam cosmological argument. Do you think the integrity of the Kalam may be threatened were we to deny divine timelessness?
Right. So timelessness, at least the way Craig does it, I haven't read through all of Andrew's book yet, where he's trying to like defend like some different versions of the Kalam. So what Craig does is you've got this timeless state of affairs where God exists without the universe, and then God is temporal with the universe. What I do in the Time Maker paper is argue it doesn't really make any sense. And a lot of people who do the work on God and time just go, Craig, I love what you're doing, but this part, I can't figure out what you're saying. And Paul Helm actually has this really funny quote where he's like, Craig is a philosopher who normally defends his views at great length. He has many things to say in justification of his views. But when it comes to this point, he is oddly silent. And you're like, oh, okay. So I think something like that's going on here. What Craig and what Andrew are up to with the Kalam argument is you want there to be this absolute beginning. So that way you don't have this infinite series of moments that God has to traverse. And then you don't have this infinite series of like this infinite causal chain. What I do is I'm like, well, it doesn't need to be a timeless thing. It doesn't need to be like, this timeless sans creation, temporal with creation. I don't know what that means. I can just say it's a temporal moment. Craig's view to get his position up and running is relying on the relational theory of time. And what I did at the beginning of this video is argued it entails a vicious circularity. So if I can just get rid of the relational theory of time, then the justification for this timeless sans creation view goes away. And then I can just say first temporal moment never began to exist. You get all the exact same results. So I think you can have the Kalam and have temporality.
Random Theology asks, can a timeless... Oh, I'm sorry. I already said...
Oh, yeah.
Because I skipped a couple questions down is why. Okay, I think... I hope I didn't miss anyone. I think I got everyone.
Cool.
Except John DeRosa.
Mm-hmm.
A $10 super chat. And John DeRosa runs the Classical Theist podcast. I listened to that. And though I have to confess, John, I'm not a classical theist. Ryan's really compelling. What can I say? So if Jordan approaches a mushroom in a field and the mushroom is otherwise static, has the mushroom really changed by gaining the property of being approached by Jordan?
Right. Okay. This is funny because I just talked to John on Monday night and we were talking a lot about Cambridge changes and stuff. So the mushroom would change not intrinsically, but this mushroom in this story is a being that is in time, and so it's undergoing succession. So so there's true facts about the mushroom being approached in a series of successive moments. So the moment it would only change, I guess you could say, relationally or extrinsically, and then it would change in terms of undergoing succession as it changes relationally relative to Jordan, and then relative to other things in its gravitational, in the same inertial frame and stuff like that. But yeah, so it wouldn't undergo an intrinsic change in that respect. But the mushroom would also undergo intrinsic changes in the fact that it's growing and whatnot. But I don't think that's what John's really wanting. I think he's wanting to abstract that stuff from the question.
Okay, I can only find 2 more questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, one is from Timothy Saunders. He said, if emergence of everything in existence was brought into existence by God's intentional state of consciousness, how does that relate to time or timelessness?
Mm-hmm. So on my view, where I want to say God's temporal, what that would be is bringing about the next moment, because a moment of time is a way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So when God brings about the existence of all this other stuff through an intentional action, that would be God making things subsequently otherwise. So the first moment you'd have God by himself, and then God intentionally brings about all this other stuff at the next moment. So that's how I would see it. That's how it relates to temporality. With timelessness, you can't have the and then subsequently otherwise in God's life. So you'd have to be God it's always been the case, timelessly the case, that God is intentionally bringing about stuff. And that's where it gets back to those problems of, maybe you'd have to affirm an eternal creation view, like a bunch of ancient philosophers did, in fact, do, where they said an eternal cause is going to bring about an eternal effect. So you can't have creation ex nihilo. You Christians, you guys are nuts with your creation ex nihilo nonsense, like eternal cause, eternal effect. Yeah. Mm.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, I can't hear you now.
Yeah. Last question here, and there was a train blowing. And I thought
Okay, yeah.
Esoptron said, if space can be created, how would that affect God being timelessly omnipresent?
Yeah, I want to say that God is not, the omnipresence is not an essential attribute of God. And there's actually lots of people in the classical tradition who affirm divine timelessness who will say the same thing. So when you get into the Protestant scholastics, they make these distinctions between what are sometimes called God's like essential attributes or his absolute attributes and his relative attributes. And so his relative attributes are attributes that he has only in relation to creation, is the way that sometimes these systematic theology textbooks like carve out reality. And omnipresence a lot of times falls on the relative side, because if you've got God and nothing else, what is he present to? He's present to himself, I guess, but that's not really omnipresence in any interesting kind of way. So he's only present to stuff. He's only omnipresent if there's stuff that exists. So so how would it affect like God? So God just wouldn't timelessly be omnipresent. It'd be only an attribute that he could have in relation to something else.
All right, and with that, we've reached the end. So I want to say that I want to echo what Bobby Nemeth said here. He said, "Thanks so much for this, Ryan. Appreciate the generosity with your time." So everyone, thank Ryan. I'm not gonna keep him on any longer because we've reached about an hour and a half. So let's pick a winner for the book. Which question do you think? I peppered you with them. Which questions stood out to you and you thought, yeah, I'm going to give it to this person?
Who asked the question about the Trinitarian, like the community of the persons of the Trinity?
Let me go back up and find that.
Yeah, because that one, it's an interesting one. It's one I've like thought about and written about before, but I just haven't been asked that in, I don't know, ever really. So I just found that really fascinating.
It was a while back, so it's taken me just.
It was one of the first, it was like the second or third question, I think.
Yes. I'm close. There we go. It was by A. McMahon.
Okay.
If God is timeless and changeless, could the members of the Trinity commune with each other? That is a really interesting question. And so, A. McMahon, if you're still watching, you won the book. And if you'll just do this, go to Facebook and send me a private message to Crash Course Apologetics, and I'll get your information and have Ryan send you the book.
Yep.
And for everyone else, thank you for watching. But most importantly, I want to publicly say thank you very much, Ryan. You're awake at 1:30 doing an interview with me. You were incredibly generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. No problem.
Check out my interview with Dr. Taylor Sear. It's very much related to this topic. We lay out the foreknowledge and freedom paradox or puzzle. And there was an entire interview spent on timelessness. So I would encourage you, go and check that out as well. Oh, look at that. Thank you so much, Brandon. Well, there it goes. Brandon 116, I wanted to put him on the screen. He gave a $4.99 super chat. Thank you. Everyone loved the conversation.
Good.
Okay. See you, everyone. Thanks.